Tension was high in the federal courtroom as years' worth of secrets and scandals were finally brought to light. Cameras clicked like distant thunder. Reporters scrawled furiously in their notebooks, and others leaned forward to watch history unfold. Every seat was occupied. This was no ordinary trial. Kody Brown, who once served as the head of a vast polygamous empire, fell from grace. He was handcuffed and wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit in place of his once flashy outfits when he sat at the defense table. He had lost the swagger that had gotten him through decades of manipulation, but his jaw was still hard and his glare fierce. He made an effort to conceal the trembling in his hands. The room fell silent when the judge walked in. Even the children's agitated shuffling in the gallery ceased. Both women were holding their breath as Christine sat in the second seat with Janelle's hand intertwined. Hey, hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, TLC Flicks. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Robin's face was white with fear as she wiped her tears with a tissue. Meri sat by herself, her stance stiff, her eyes fixed on Kody, not with love, nor with want, but with the determination of someone who had finally run out of patience. It sounded like the crack of thunder when the gavel struck. The judge's tone was resolute, firm, and decisive. Kody Brown, you were convicted of several federal offenses. You have been condemned to 22 years in federal prison for your offenses. The words fell into the silence like stones. The crowd echoed with gasps. Christine leaned toward Janelle, her lips quivering. The silence was broken by Robin's sob. Furthermore, Meri remained still. She never took her eyes off Kody. Kody's response was immediate. The chains rattled violently when he banged his fists against the table. "This is a fraud. This cannot be done to me." With anger in his voice, he yelled. "Everything was built by myself. Any of them have a life at all because of me." His remarks reverberated like a desperate man holding on to what little authority he still had as the bailiffs tightened their hold on him. However, nobody defended him. Not his spouses. Not his kids. Not even Robin. Kody Brown was genuinely alone for the first time, and the heavy door of freedom creaked open for the first time for the family he had ruled for decades. Suffocating and indisputable, the statement lingered in the air like smoke. The last illusion of Kody Brown's control had vanished along with the gavel. Christine's heart pounded as she sat stiffly in her chair. She had been dreaming about this moment for years. Not his demise, but his reckoning. She recalled the innumerable evenings she had spent in tears by herself, the way his favoritism, his rage, and his rejection of her value had weakened her spirit. 22 years later, when the judge's words replayed in her memory, a slight but indisputable sense of comfort filled her chest. With an unsaid yet unbreakable tie, she tightened her grip on Janelle's hand. Ever the silent warrior, Janelle silently shed her tears. Despite Kody's demands for her allegiance, she had long since come to terms with the flaws in their marriage and established her own independence. She felt both sorrow and relief as she watched him flail in his chains. This marked the end of Kody's dominance, as well as the shadow she had endured for many years. Robin held a tissue in both hands as she sat apart, her shoulders shaking. She had supported him, trusted his assurances, and taken his words at face value for a very long time. Now, however, she was unable to ignore what he had become into in the clinical light of the courtroom. Her children's father, whom she believed to be her guardian, was now a prisoner of his own deceptions. Her emotions were more intense, not only for him but also for the family that his decisions had split. Meri was the next in line. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she sat tall with her back straight. Calm on the outside, but brewing storm on the inside. She had anticipated this day, not the precise decision or punishment, but the point at which Kody's authority would ultimately crumble. He had deprived her of respect, affection, and dignity. He had referred to her as disposable. But here she was, witnessing his kingdom fall apart before his very eyes. They had already begun to loosen the ties that had bound them all to Kody. A few had already broken years ago. But suddenly, in this one instant, all the threads broke. Nobody hurried over to him. Nobody stood up for him. Nobody made an effort to lessen the blow. Once held together by terror and faith, the spouses, kids, and family were now free. Meri was aware in her heart that she still had a part to play in this tale. Whatever delusions Kody still held onto would be destroyed by the secret she carried, the ultimate truth. The sentence may have been delivered in the courtroom. Meri, however, had her own. When Meri carefully got up from her seat, the courtroom was still filled with the reverberations of the judge's punishment. All eyes turned to her when the shuffle of her chair on the floor broke the stillness. She had been the quiet one for years. The first wife, the one abandoned. The one Kody discarded when she didn't fit his goals. The only one standing now was her. Meri didn't ask permission, but the judge's eyebrows lifted as he looked up. She didn't require it. At first, her voice was quiet, but it had a strength that hadn't been present in decades. He pulled his head up as she said, "Kody." His scorching, disdainful gaze narrowed. "This is the end of your control," Meri added, pointing around the courtroom. "You perverted our lives for years, making us believe that everything had to be about you. You told us we were useless without you, made fun of us and hushed us. But now, without you, here we are. And we are more powerful than you could have ever guessed." With his chains rattling and a sneer creeping over his face, Kody leaned forward. "You consider yourself strong? Without me, do you think any of you are anything? This family was created by myself. I made you a purpose. You're just a bitter, broken woman without me." This time, nobody recoiled as the words cut like knives across the room. Janelle's eyes blazed, Christine's jaw tensed, and Robin even gave a slow shake of her head while a tear ran down her face. Meri remained steadfast. Her voice sharpened like steel as she moved closer to the front. "No, Kody, we're not damaged. We are at liberty." Her voice trembled but remained steady. "You once told me that I was disposable. You wanted me to think I was worthless. However, you were mistaken. I'm still here. Additionally, I won't give you the final say." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Cameras focused on her face as reporters scrawled frantically. Even the normally stoic judge leaned forward a little. Meri's hands shook at her sides, but she kept her gaze fixed on Kody. She had been suppressed by his pride and his rage for decades, living in his shadow. However, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years as she stood in front of him today. Strength. Truth's power. The ability to survive. The ability to ultimately free her from his control. Meri was aware of what was about to happen, even though Kody tried to drown her out with venom by laughing in her face. The last secret. The final reality. The one who would take away whatever sense of control he believed he still has. Every breath in the room was held in suspense as Meri dug into her bag. She curled her fingers around a folder that had been clutched too firmly, too often, and was worn at the corners. The truth that she had been holding in secret, waiting for the right time, was her weapon. For the first time that day, a glimmer of discomfort appeared on Kody's face as his gaze shifted to the folder. With a steady voice, Meri raised it high. "Kody, you always believed that you were untouchable. That nobody would ever hold you responsible for anything you did. However, I discovered the truth. And this is where it ends." Her hands shaking, but her will unwavering, she opened the folder. The courtroom was surrounded by page after page of documentation, including bank records, transactions, and confidentially signed contracts. Meri's voice echoed as she said, "Kody Brown has been hiding money. He transferred money to hidden holdings by siphoning it from our family accounts and the children's trust funds. He was planning his escape while preaching sacrifice and loyalty. He was robbing his own relatives." The gallery echoed with gasps. Pens racing, reporters leaned forward. Christine's eyes began to well up with tears as her hand shot to her mouth. Janelle's entire body shook as her lips formed a thin line of anger. Robin, who had previously had the utmost faith in him, shook her head in shock and shed new tears. Kody's chains clanged as he jumped to his feet. "Falsehoods. She's telling lies. All of this is a lie." His voice was harder and louder than before, cracking with desperation. "None of that is significant. They're attempting to ruin me." However, his mask slipped further the more he yelled. In front of everyone, the self-assurance and haughtiness that had sustained him during years of dominance were disintegrating. Instead of a patriarch, the courtroom witnessed a desperate guy who was surrounded by his own dishonesty. With the documents in her hands like a shield of truth, Meri took a step closer. Even though her voice had become soft, it was still sharper than a scream. Kody, you deceived all of us. Not as a husband alone. Not only as a dad. You compromised the future of your own children. And you can never get away from that. The ensuing hush was heartbreaking. Kody's body shook with anger as his face turned scarlet. But there was something else in his eyes, beneath the rage. Fear. Kody Brown was terrified for the first time. Meri was aware that she had finally pierced his final line of defense. As though the walls themselves were holding their breath, the courtroom was quiet yet pulsing with emotion. Kody stood shaking in his chains, his voice raspy from yelling denials, his face hot with rage. But now nobody paid attention. There was the proof, exposed and indisputable. Meri took a step forward, bringing them closer. She carried the burden of years spent in his shadow with her every stride, making it purposeful. He had loomed over her for so long, disregarding her and shattering her spirit. Now, however, she was taller for the first time. The past and present merged in that electrified space as their eyes met. Meri's voice trembled but unflinchingly replied, "You once told me I was disposable. You claimed that I was unnecessary and that I didn't matter. I wore those sentences around my neck like chains for years." Kody spat out his response with a sneer. "Since it was accurate. You lacked strength. This family couldn't be held together by you. You couldn't." Meri, however, remained intact. She moved closer yet, close enough to see the fear concealed beneath his rage. She whispered gently, "You're wrong," in a voice like velvet-wrapped steel. "I wasn't weak. I made it through you. I made it through every insult, every betrayal, and every time you shoved me away. And now, Kody, you're the one who is chained." As though the balance of power had finally been established, the room began to move. Janelle gave a firm nod. Christine brushed away her tears, and even Robin, her face dripping with grief, was unable to deny the reality. Meri's hands trembled, but her eyes remained fixed. "You believed you would always be in charge of us. But you're powerless today. Not above me. Not over Robin, Janelle, or Christine. Not in front of our kids. Your rule is over." The bailiff seized Kody as he pushed forward, his shackles rattling wildly. A scream broke out in his voice. "Meri, you'll regret this. All of you will." Meri, however, did not recoil. With her face inches from his, she took a final stride and spoke in a final low voice. "No, Kody. You are the only one who will regret. Additionally, you will have 22 years to consider it." Her words seemed to crush him with their weight. His rage dissolved into stillness as he slumped against the guards. And Meri felt the bonds that had shackled her spirit start to loosen for the first time in decades. Kody struggled against the bailiffs, his chains clanking like thunder in the quiet courtroom as they tightened their hold. His voice was harsh with anger, and his face was red. "Meri." His words were loud, fractured, and frantic as he yelled. "This cannot be done to me. I created you all. I gave it all to you." However, nobody responded. Not Christine, who sat with her hands clenched in her lap, eyes unblinking but tears streaming down her cheeks. Not Janelle, who gazed at him with the piercing determination of a woman who had at last been proved right. Not even his hitherto faithful defender Robin, who now hid her face in her hands and sobbed uncontrollably. Kody's remarks were flattened after bouncing off the courtroom walls. His strength, the authoritative voice that used to compel wives and kids to comply with his wishes, was gone. "Put in order." The judge slammed the gavel and yelled. However, there was no need to silence the room. The sight of a man who had previously stood untouchable being reduced to little more than a prisoner in chains had already caused the people inside to become silent. He was pulled toward the exit by the bailiffs. His hands jerked against the restraints that sank into his skin, and his boots scratched the glossy floor. His shouts weakened and turned into a jumble of supplications and obscenities. He yelled Meri's name once more, but she remained motionless, her expression composed and unreadable, depriving him of the gratification of a response. For a brief moment, his anger dominated the room as the heavy double doors groaned open. Then, with a loud echo, the doors behind him slammed shut, permanently silencing him and halting his voice. There was a startled silence in the courtroom. The guy who had formerly dominated every aspect of their lives was gone after decades of turmoil, deceit, and suffering. Meri breathed slowly and tremblingly. The silence felt liberating for the first time in years. The air seemed to change as the massive courthouse doors closed. Just a few moments ago, the room was filled with Kody's rage. Now, it was oddly silent, almost brittle. It was Christine who broke first. With sobs trembling through her body, she covered her face with both hands. She had endured the wounds of his cruelty and negligence for years, but now that he was gone, she experienced a sense of relief that she hadn't permitted herself to have in decades. Janelle put her arm over her and drew her closer. Janelle's eyes were wet as well, but there was more than sadness in her face. It was power. After fighting for so long to keep herself and her kids safe from Kody's influence, the battle was finally finished. Robin sat shakily, her eyes red and puffy. She had been the last to believe the version of Kody he wanted the world to see, the last to defend him, the last to cling to him. But even she was unable to deny what he had done after hearing Meri's statements and seeing the documents exposed. She cried for the life that would never be again, for her children, and for the guy she believed to be her acquaintance. Meri was the next in line. She refrained from crying. She didn't shudder. Her hands remained steady as she stood erect, her eyes focused on the location where Kody had been sitting just minutes earlier. She had felt invisible for so long, discarded, degraded, and referred to as disposable. But she had been the one to reveal the last truth today. She had been the one to take away the last remnant of his authority today. Janelle followed Christine as she stretched for her hand, their fingers entwining in a silent gesture of solidarity. They were standing together once more after years of separation, jealousy, and hurt, not as wives vying for crumbs of love, but as women who had made it through. After a long while, even Robin got to her feet. Despite her tentative steps and sad eyes, she eventually stood next to them. She reached out with a trembling hand, but neither Christine nor Janelle withdrew. All four stood shoulder to shoulder for the first time in years. Their kids watched in silence in the gallery. They all felt it, some with tears, some with fury, some with relief. A change. A start. The dad had left the battered and broken Brown family. However, there was a glimmer of something new, healing, in the rubble he left behind. Only remnants of the mayhem that had occurred hours before remained in the empty courtroom. The room was covered by the weight of Kody's absence, which was both oppressive and freeing. The spouses experienced independence for the first time in decades. Meri paused, staring at the empty spot where he had been pulled away. She was reminded of years of deceit, broken promises, and quiet anguish. She recalled being termed throwaway, disregarded, and dismissed. She recalled the times she had questioned her own value and the nights she had sobbed by herself. Still, she was standing here. She was stronger than she ever thought she would be. She steadied herself, took a deep breath, and muttered, "Goodbye, Kody," not for him but for herself. Christine moved to stand next to her and placed her hand over Meri's. Robin, still shaking, finally put her hand on top of the others as Janelle joined them. They didn't talk because they didn't need to. Their mutual understanding, their shared suffering, and the silent victory of survival weighed heavily on their silence. Warm, enticing sunlight poured through the windows of the courthouse outside. Together, the women entered there bearing their kids, the burden of their pasts, and the promise of the future. The Brown family had faced unthinkable hardships, but they had come out on the other side, broken but unbroken, and free to start over without fear or control. Meri's eyes gleamed with determination as she glanced forward. She felt free of the shadow of another person for the first time in her life. She had the power to control her own destiny, make her own decisions, and recover the happiness and tranquility that Kody had attempted to take away. This marked the close of one chapter and the start of another. A chapter written with power, courage, and freedom to live their lives as they see fit, rather than with fear, manipulation, or compliance. And that new chapter was only getting started for the Browns. It was weird in the days following Kody's departure from their life. Once tense and governed by unwritten rules, the Brown home felt almost strangely peaceful. Decisions were not subject to his approval, judgment, or influence for the first time in decades. Meri began modestly. She regained the aspects of her life that Kody had long attempted to repress: her independence, her voice, and her passions. She started getting back in touch with friends and family she had lost touch with, and she discovered happiness in small routines like laughing with her kids in the evenings and having coffee in the morning without anxiety. She was reminded of the strength she had held all along by each tiny victory of independence. Christine found herself thinking back on her life of silent subjection. Now that Kody was no longer a continuous presence, she could work on the goals and projects she had put off for a long time. She listened to her kids without being distracted by Kody's favoritism or meddling, and she reestablished a deeper, more meaningful connection with them. Slowly, the laughing that had been uncommon in her household reappeared. Ever the strong one in the family, Janelle took the initiative in ways she had never ventured before. She planned family get-togethers, facilitated discussions about love and trust with the kids, and set an example of fortitude in the face of treachery. Fear and tension gave way to honesty and respect in her home. Even Robin, who was dealing with her own mixed emotions, started to realize how important self-respect and boundaries are. She gradually unraveled the control patterns that Kody had embedded in their lives by attending therapy sessions and family counseling. She gained acceptance and clarity with every step. After being caught up in the chaos of Kody's caprices, the kids started to thrive. They were free to talk, follow their passions, and show their feelings without fear of condemnation or repression. They witnessed firsthand the strength of truth and resiliency as they watched their mothers bravely navigate life. Even though there were still deep and enduring scars, the Brown family learned that freedom meant more than just being free from Kody's tyranny. It meant having choice, dignity, and the power to direct their own lives. Meri glanced around at the ladies who had once vied for her affections and favors, but were now bound together by their common survival and newly discovered strength. Together, they were starting to rebuild, not just as a family, but as individuals as well, after enduring storms that had threatened to destroy them. The true adventure has only barely begun for the Browns. After Kody was imprisoned for several months, the Brown family was gradually learning to live without his shadow. The once tense, whispery house was now filled with laughter, conversation, and the buzz of everyday activities that were no longer controlled by manipulation or fear. Meri had begun to consider her own goals. She started helping in her community, reconnected with long-lost acquaintances, and enrolled in classes she had put off for years. Every new endeavor and experience served as a reminder that her own bravery and decisions, rather than Kody's authority, defined her. She was regaining her self-confidence, and the world reacted well to her assurance. Christine accepted her artistic side. She started throwing intimate parties and establishing areas where her kids and friends could flourish. There was now space for joy in her heart, which had before been burdened by the memories of neglect. She discovered that her children's tenacity reflected her own newly discovered strength and encouraged them to follow their passions without being constrained by Kody's expectations. Janelle concentrated on family leadership. She fostered relationships among the kids, made sure all opinions were heard, and assisted in resolving conflicts. Her house turned into a haven of mutual respect, trust, and accountability. Love and responsibility have taken the place of fear as the dominant force. Still negotiating the intricacies of her own feelings, Robin started establishing limits she had never previously enforced. She was able to reinterpret her role as a mother, a partner to herself, and an independent woman through therapy, open communication, and alone time, rather than as Kody's enabler. She discovered that self-respect could blossom even after betrayal. The kids did well. They developed relationships with their mothers based on genuineness rather than compliance, freely expressed themselves, and pursued their gifts. They were exposed to a household where support, honesty, and communication were the norm for the first time. The Browns were starting to view the future as a vista full of opportunities rather than as a chain, despite the residual effects of the past. Their lives were now characterized by resilience, choice, and the silent force of freedom rather than by fear or manipulation. Additionally, Kody had lost his role in their everyday lives, even though he was still a part of their story. The Brown family's women had taken back their voices, their authority, and the freedom to choose their own happiness. It was a difficult trip, But for the first time in decades, life without Kody was authentic, unadulterated, and wholly their own. Let us know in your comments. And stay tuned by subscribing our channel to get more updates like this. Thanks everyone.